Okay.
Okay. Our guest today is Jeri Westerson, author of medieval mysteries, historical novels, and paranormal books. Jeri has served 2 terms as president of the Southern California chapter of Mystery Writers of America. She's also a member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America and the Historical Novel Society. Her Crispin medieval novels were nominated for 13 national awards. She frequently gives lectures on medieval history at local colleges and museums. She's even a library steward, she was saying, because she has a little free library, I suppose you still have it, outside her house full of children's books she lends to the community. So now let us hear some more and welcome Jeri.
Hello, hello.
Oh,
Nice to see you, Jeri.
And my little free library has a lot of mystery books too from
Really?
a lot of my mystery writing friends. So you get a lot of mystery books out of that. So yeah, I'm around books all the time.
Yeah, I am.
So which is a nice thing because
Yes.
books, and I think during this pandemic, I think we have appreciated the arts far more than we have in the past, maybe. Um, all the things we're live streaming, and of course, all the books we're reading on any sort of platform. A lot of my books are on audiobook, and I think those are considered reading a book. By the way, if you're doing a book report, you can listen to an audiobook and consider that a book. So that's always fun because it's just a different platform with a different sort of interpretation, like a movie or a TV show. But it is the words of your book. So I'm happy to be published in any form these days. But I'm here to talk about, well, a lot of things, but I think I'm going to be talking mostly about the historical writing. That seems to be the thing I have, well, the most books in the series, the Crispin Guest Medieval Noir series. That begins with The Veil of Lies. This is the newest cover, by the way. If you're looking for the book and you've seen other covers, this is the only one available now. So there you go. When you decide to write a book and you decide that it's going to be a mystery, then you decide that it's going to be historical, well, go home. Don't do that. No, just kidding. But it's a lot of extra things that you've just decided to do. Now, mine was going to be historical, the series that I was going to begin. And because I have been writing historical novels, one-offs, for a number of years, but not getting published, I consulted with a former agent of mine. I'm on my 4th agent, by the way. A former agent, and we are in good standing with each other. She said, your medieval stuff is great, but have you thought about writing a mystery? Because a mystery is a great market because there are publishers who just publish mysteries. There are bookstores who just have mysteries. There are numerous mystery fan conventions where you can meet readers. Mystery is always solid. There's always a mystery or a thriller on the bestseller list. So I thought, well, okay, that's a good idea. I don't know how to write a mystery, but let's explore that. So the historical mystery I decided that I was going to write was going to be a little different. It was going to be, I decided, a medieval noir. And if you're not familiar with noir stories, noir is French for black. The noir idea came from film noir, very popular in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s. And these films, these American films, were all usually about a detective, sometimes a police detective, sometimes a private detective. And to paraphrase, things started out screwed up and go downhill from there. So think of, in this case, No Detective, think of Double Indemnity. That's a film noir, if you remember that, Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray. So, these two people plot a murder. And this is not something you should be doing. So will go downhill from there. But I sort of liked more of the hard-boiled detective, Sam Spade, Maltese Falcon, and Christopher Marlowe. So you know from Raymond Chandler stories. So I was aiming my idea of a detective in that vein, that he would be a hard-boiled detective, as opposed to a monk or a nun, and the various iterations that you found in most medieval mysteries of the current bookshelf. So I wanted him to be a particular type. He had to be following the tropes of your hard-boiled detective. He was going to be a loner, chip on his shoulder. Something has happened to pretty much put him down in the dumps. He was a sucker for a dame in trouble. So he would get involved in a caper or something, a heist, because of a woman or something. So I was trying to figure out how to work this out. And what I did was I took the Maltese Falcon, one of my all-time favorite books, and I literally took it apart. I took it apart chapter by chapter, beat by beat. What happened at the end of every chapter? How did it propel you to read the next? And the mystery, how did that unfold? How did the people react to each other, the characters? And that has wonderful characters in that book. I do recommend you reading it. Of course, the 1941 film, John Huston directed and pretty much wrote the script for it. It's the only version, and there has been versions before. It's the only version that's really tight to the book. So read the book. It's a fast read, and it just gives you the idea. But probably one of the most important aspects of the book that caught my attention was the Falcon. It creates this mystery about it. You know, everybody wants the Falcon. What is the Falcon? And as a reader going, what is it? Get to it already. So I thought that in this medieval mystery, that the thing closely associated with Falcon, and I'm looking at my Maltese Falcon on a shelf above, right across from me right now. I have one. This is stuff that dreams are made of. So the Falcon, it can be translated into a religious relic or venerated object in the series. So each book has a religious relic that the people are trying to get, or they're trying to get rid of and sell, or somebody stole it. So that sort of gives the plot a little impetus. Sometimes it's very important to the story. Sometimes it isn't. It's just something that flashes in the story, and then things veer off from there. Just to, to punch it up, make it different every time. So coming up with the main character, of course, was the first thing. So Crispin Guest is the main character. He becomes a hard-boiled detective because he lost everything. He was a knight, he was a lord, and he backed the wrong horse when Richard II was going to be crowned king. Richard was 10 years old at the time. His uncle, John of Gaunt, was the richest man in England, a statesman, a warrior. Crispin was in his household, raised in his household, and so he fell into this plot to put John of Gaunt on the throne instead of Richard. So Crispin was caught, along with other conspirators, and he was going to be executed in a particularly nasty way, as treason, as traitors work. But John of Gaunt spoke for him, and the young King Richard released him. But he was losing everything. He was losing his title, his lands, everything that defined him, and he was let loose with nothing but the shirt on his back. So such a man who was rich, who moved in the company of the court and other wealthy and powerful people, had to redefine himself. What was he going to do? How was he going to live? He had to make a living now. What was he going to do? So a man who had all of this capacity for fighting with weapons, for languages, for chivalry, because he was a knight, and so he it was very important to him to maintain honor. So as you know, as these things and began to think about these things, his character unfolded and created avenues for extra plot points. Because when I write by mysteries, it's not just the mystery, because I figured maybe there's somebody who figures it out right away. What else have they got to do but now live with these characters and what is going on with these characters? So Crispin became this very interesting man that I could write about. How was he coping with his life now that he's stumbled into becoming a tracker, which was my version of a medieval detective? And the answer was not very well, especially when we meet him in the first book. And he is 7 years exiled from court, and he's still not taking it well. Now, as when you write a series, it's a wonderful thing because what you're doing is creating the biggest novel ever, because each book is like a new chapter in their life. Because as I started writing, the first 3, I think, are the same year, but as we go on, each book becomes another year in their life. And you can see how things change for him and how he grows and how in some ways he doesn't and in other ways he will. And for one, he had he sort of got himself a servant. He didn't want this kid, but he was this 11-year-old orphan who was living on the streets as a cut purse, a pickpocket. You know, literally, your purses are hanging on your belt. He cut that purse and stole it for the coins and such. So he was, Crispin discovers him, and if you go to, where is it? There. If you go with Cup of Blood, that's where he actually first meets Jack. This is called a prequel. It's number 7, but it's actually number 1, because this is actually the first book I wrote in the series that didn't get published. This one got published first, and I wrote it with that in mind because with my fellow sisters in crime, and that is a mystery writer and reader organization. It's not a confluence of crazy nuns. Sisters in Crime. Their experience with writing new series is sometimes the first in the series won't get published for whatever reason. You're just establishing the characters and you haven't got them together yet. Just establishing a mystery, you haven't figured out how to write that. So by the second, most people have figured that out. So I wrote this in mind that it could be the first, and it works out just fine. But I rewrote Cup of Blood. I worked on it, got it edited, and self-published it. And it works out just fine. It actually got 2 award nominations, so that was fine. So Jack Tucker is the character that Crispin, he sort of wends his way into Crispin's life, becomes his servant, and later his apprentice. So he creates a lot of other things that is helpful. For one, he stands in for the reader. He asks the questions that we ask as we're reading. Well, why isn't this happening? Who's that? And what? And then Crispin can talk directly to us through him. And so that's very helpful. But also Jack gets to grow up throughout the series. So that gives me, the writer, extra things to do and extra things to bounce off of Crispin and to help temper him and mellow him a little bit. So that was a handy thing as well. Now, when you're researching a book, a series, when you're researching a time period, you really do have to immerse yourself and you have to figure out all the things you need to research. And of course, I was already a medievalist interested in that time period, so I knew a lot of things. But as you write, you begin to realize how much you don't know and that you need to know to make this a fulfilled world. So lots of little things that just add little details. You don't want to have pages and pages of stuff you've researched. That's not good. It's not good in historical novels, and in novels especially, because it's supposed to be a magic trick to the reader. You're not supposed to let them know how much you research. You're just supposed to let things open like a flower. All this information is there, but much of it is background that helps color the whole narration and all of that. So you feel just enough detail that you feel that what you're reading is solid information, and you get a feel for the world that they're living in. You know, it's as if they're doing a play and it's set in the medieval period, and somebody's cell phone goes off and really blows all of the stuff that the foundation you're trying to lay. So you have to know all these little things. So number one, it's set in London, in a medieval London. And this is Crispin's London. And his London is 1.12 square miles. So this is the old Roman wall. That's not there anymore. But then there's also a little bit extra out here. And that is London. That's all of London. Now, if you want to go to Westminster, you have to go that way to get to the other city called Westminster that got swallowed up as London, and Westminster is just part of that. But this was it. As you can see, it's pretty tight. But if you imagine this, this was the second most populous city in Europe at that time. Now we're talking in the late 1380s. There were 50,000 people in London, they believe. 50,000 people in this area without any sewers. So think about that for a minute. The Thames is an interesting river because it's a tidal river. It goes in and out with the tide. So sometimes it's very high and sometimes it's very low. So what they did for some sanitations, they had public outhouses, but they put them along the Thames. So when the tide came in, it would clean it out, and when the tide went out, it would take it with it. Sort of makes fishing in the river just a little ickier when you think about it. So, and it had one London Bridge. It didn't have any other bridges yet, not yet. There are a lot of ferrymen that would ferry you across if you needed to go. And this is Suffolk, so this is where the Tabard Tavern is. If you read your Chaucer, your Canterbury Tales, that's where they all begin their journey to Canterbury. So that's there. This is the Tower of London. And it still had a moat in those days because it was a castle. It was a place that the king could stay if he wanted to. I mean, Westminster was only 15 minutes away by walking, depending on where you were. But, you know, so it's not that far. It's like over here. So you could see the streets, how they just developed. And there are a lot of churches, and I didn't show them all. There's just a few that I did show. They're monasteries. But this is enough to have murder and mayhem going on and telling stories, because things happen in this town. So these are things you have to know, that this is what London looked like. And what I like to do is I like to take this and then go to Google Earth and look at London now. And then you can see how far things are from each other. Some of the same streets are there. Where Crispin lives is the Butcher's District, called the Shambles. And that you can kind of look at what it is today and what it is here. So it's fun that you can find all these streets still there. A lot of them have been clumped together and there's buildings all over them and things, but some of the original streets are still there. His favorite tavern is called the Boar's Tusk, and it's on Gutter Lane. And I thought, well, that's a good place for the down and outers, and it's still there, but there's a lot of fancier restaurants there now, so you won't be finding terrible taverns. But those are things that you have to know. Sanitation, I just touched on that. And now I'm washing my hands. No, so sanitation, in no big city at that time had a sewer system, not yet. So there were laws. I know you've seen this in films and such, but of people dumping their chamber pots out the window. Well, there were laws against doing that because people are disgusting and they will do it. But a lot of times they won't because that's their own house and things get on the walls and you don't want to do that. They had outhouses. Everybody had an outhouse in their backyard, or if you had your own little house. London was interesting because it just had that little square miles of it. Instead of spreading out, which they weren't quite allowed to do yet because people owned that property. A lot of churches own that property, bishops, people like that own property out there. They built up. So you had 2 and 3 stories of buildings. You had the shop down below, and you had your house in the middle where you lived, and maybe you rented out the top loft. So that made for lots of shadowy corners and little tiny streets that were shaded, and so that was good for the bad guy to hide in and leap out at. And so there was lots of things like that. A lot of laws. So you're looking at all the rules and the laws that they had. You weren't allowed to. I mean, if you had a couple of properties and they were right across from each other on the street, you wanted to be able to get to it without going down the hoi polloi. So sometimes you built bridges across. Well, that was illegal, especially if you couldn't ride a horse under it. It had to be tall enough that a rider on a horse had to pass under it. So they have these laws. It's not like it's a free-for-all in the Middle Ages. In fact, they had tons of laws, lots of court activity, and they were suing each other left and right. I mean, the poor people were suing rich people, and they won, and so the courts were very interested. So now this leads you to the courts in your research. And it seems like, okay, so there was some corruption, there was some bribes. The sheriffs of London, there were 2 sheriffs of London, and they were elected every year by the merchant association, all the burgesses, and it was a volunteer position. It was supposed to be honor because there you are doing that, and a later law soon about this time, you had to be a sheriff if you wanted to be Lord Mayor, to be elected Lord Mayor. So a lot of people took on the job as sheriff. Now, a sheriff mostly just kept the peace. Sheriff wasn't going to do a lot of investigating crimes. When I delved into this, it seemed very odd that a lot of what the laws were, and the laws were at court, the jury was made up of people that you knew. Now, today, that's quite the opposite. You didn't want anybody that knew anything to do with the case, because that was fair. It seems fair. But in those days, they thought it was more fair to you if the people judging you knew you, which is good or bad, right? Because if you're a bad guy, they all know it. So, but you can imagine the bribery that kind of went on to the sheriff, the sheriff's not getting paid for this, remember? So bribery to the sheriff and bribery to the jury. But strangely enough, there did seem to be good amount of justice. I particularly was looking at murder cases, those who were being tried for murder, and what happened in these cases. It was a good amount of people who were found not guilty, and I don't account for that for all the bribes. I think they were pretty fair. Now, the people who had to do the investigation was essentially the jury. Now, if you think of London, you can't think of it like we do now, where the whole city is one cohesive thing. The city is divided up into wards. There were over 25 different wards and parishes. The parishes are just around each little church. So there's a lot of churches. There's a church for every corner. So these are all divided up into these little places. And usually, unless your shopping took you into a different part of town, you really wouldn't be any other place. So it's not like some guy from one area would murder somebody way over there, and then he'd go back and nobody would ever find him. Because that wouldn't happen. Everybody in your neighborhood heard you arguing with this guy, and the next morning, guy A is dead. Mm-hmm. So who are they going to accuse? Mm-hmm. Guy B that had the argument with him. And because everybody knew you, they knew whether it was likely or unlikely that you killed. At that point, of course, you confessed a lot because everybody was very religious, and they figured if they confessed, they could, get a little less time in purgatory, maybe work their way up to heaven. So there was a lot of that kind of stuff. You knew the guy, then you knew whether he was guilty or not. And trials lasted about 5 to 10 minutes. So that's justice going on for you, or against you. But that's the background of somebody who is solving crimes. What can they expect? And of course, I had to write one of those stories where Crispin gets accused of murder, and it looks pretty bad for him. So he goes to trial, and we get to see how that actually works. And because I can't have a book that lasts 5-10 minutes, naturally, it has to be extended, and it's actually one of the more amusing ones. Anyway, that's called A Maiden Weeping, by the way. If you're looking for that. So the other thing about the time period, about knowing what it's like, it's funny because when you're writing a contemporary book, you know that everybody knows what French fries taste like, what a cell phone is, streets and certain streets in a city. These are common things that we all know. So when you write historically, you have a certain amount of world building to do. You have to present enough information to the reader where they can settle in and go, okay, I know what things are like. But one of the things is food and drink. And there's a lot of drinking in England. There's a lot of drinking in London. And you have to wipe out some of the myths and fallacies people have had about this time period. Like that people didn't bathe. They bathed. They just didn't bathe every day. And most people wouldn't have a full immersion bathtub because you need servants to put all that hot water in there. So, spit baths. There are people in living memory that remember the Saturday night bath, right? Because you'd have to pump that water or heat it. And so the master of the house, the most important person, gets the nice hot bath. And on down the line, all the kids, the littlest kid gets the cold bath with all the dirt from everybody else. Saturday night, because you're all going to church the next morning, so you want to be clean. So, but that's also something that's with going away from living memory. A lot of people, that's part of your world building. You need to do all that stuff. So, food. The kind of food they were eating. There was fast food on the street, by the way. You can buy meat pie. My favorite things are larks on a stick. You get songbirds on a stick for your fast food. You walk around town, biting off a lark for your little meal there. But for food, of course, we know a lot of the fancy cooking, the fancy recipes. 14th century was about the time that cookbooks were becoming popular. Now, when I say cookbook and when I say popular, I'm talking about manor houses, royal houses. Those cookbooks are being created by the cooks in these places and getting shared to other manor houses, and not the hoi polloi, not you and me, okay? That's not happening. But that's when they began. And they actually derived from the Middle East And these were physicians' prescription books, because a lot of the things that they created were recipes for various poultices and things that you drink and eat. So that sort of developed the idea of a recipe. I have lots of medieval cookery books. One of them is the Table of Richard II. Richard II is the king during this time period. And it tells you fancy things like how to cook a cockatrice. And a cockatrice is a mythological creature with the front end of a bird and the back end of a four-legged creature, like a griffin, you know. So basically, it tells you in Middle English, ye take a goose and ye smite it athwart, and ye take a pig and ye smite it athwart. So basically, what you're doing is you're cutting a goose off at the rear, and you're cutting a pig in the middle, and you sew these things together. You know, you pluck the goose and all that. You sew them together, you cook them, and you reserve the feathers because you're putting them back on. And you're making this fancy thing with the wings already outstretched out with the wing, and you know, gold. You can put gold. Well, it's not real gold, but sometimes you could. But usually it's saffron kind of thing that you paint on it to make it look gold. So here you are serving a cockatrice to the king. So, you know, I want you to all go home tonight. Cook for your family. Cockatrice.
Oh
and, you know, you can get cockatrice helper so that you don't have to do so much work. Cockatrice. So, that, I mean, it's a fun thing. I'm not going to do that. What I did is more simple things. There's a really wonderful recipe for, and you get those little hens, those Cornish game hens, and it's roasted with stuffed with grapes. That's really good. And an interesting thing is there's a dipping sauce. There's a parsnip fritter that you can make. Parsnip fritter. It's fried, you know, battered and fried. And the dipping sauce is something very common that you can find now. Almond milk. Almond milk was very popular in the Middle Ages, not for drinking, because that's a lot of work for drinking, but for a dipping sauce. So everything old is new again. I just love that. The almond milk is fancy. But one of course, the thing that they drank a lot of was ale. And it's not beer. This is ale. The difference in those days was hops. They weren't using in England, they weren't using hops yet. So it was ale. Now, hops does a lot of flavoring. My husband is an award-winning home brewer, so I know all this stuff. Beer, ale, hops does a lot of flavoring of the beer to give it different flavors, but it also preserves it. So when you don't have a preservative in your beer, you gotta drink a lot of it. Well, you are drinking a lot of it. It's not because the water was undrinkable, because in London, there were cisterns all over London to get your water. You don't want to get it out of the Thames because you know what happens in the Thames. So you're getting your water from wells, from your own catch basins for rain. Rained a lot, so there's a lot of rain. A lot of water. There's a lot of water around. Good water to drink. But why would you drink water when you can drink ale? So there was a lot of that. But the newer it is, the less alcohol is going on, because the yeast doesn't get a chance to eat all the sugars in your grain and create alcohol. So the sooner you're drinking this beer, the less alcohol it is. So, you know, so my husband and I made medieval beer, ale, and we wanted to start all the way to the grain. Very interesting, because you let the grain sprout just a little, so it's all got little green guys all over it, and then you halt that process by drying it. Now we don't have a big Kyle house. They call it a Kyle house, where you dry all this grain on the floor, essentially. Like it would be up higher in this building, because heat rises, so it's warmer up there. You'd spread it all out on this floor. You're making lots of ale. But we did it the fast way. We put it in a pillowcase and put it in the dryer on low. So put it in the dryer. So it came out. And what happens is that stops the sprouting, but it begins the process for, probably saying this wrong, it begins the process where it's beginning to malt it. It doesn't malt it completely until you cook it. But first you have to grind it. And so we had a grinder. He has his grinder because he starts his beer from the grain. Ground it, and then you cook it, big vat. And then it's beginning to smell pretty good because the sugars are now rising. The malt is happening. So it smells like a good breakfast for you. Breakfast of champions, beer. So you're doing that, and then you're what you do to make your next. You don't add yeast. I mean, he does, but they didn't know from yeast in those days. They didn't. They knew something was happening. So what you do is you save the barm, which is the bottom of your pot with all the foam. That's where all the yeast is settled. You save that. You're making sourdough. All beer is sourdough. And you say that you put that in your beer that you're making, and you separate out the grain, and you let that sit a little bit. And they added all kinds of things. They added all kinds of herbal things to them. So they have these different flavors. It was quite interesting. Tansy, flowers, things that you would, carnations, all kinds of things you add, and that would make your beer. Of course, mead, make your mead too. So that's a flavor that you can. Okay, so I'm relating to this flavor, and giving that to my character, how he's enjoying it, and the food that I made, and so the next thing is clothing. Now, for women, it's not bad wearing medieval clothing, because this is the time before corsets. You're not being bound up in anything. It's still a shift, and then an overdress. The sleeves were loosely, they're either pinned or sewn so you can take them off. Now, underneath that sleeve, the outer sleeve, is an inner sleeve of your shift. Isn't there a white linen shift? That would be what you'd wear. And by the way, ladies, that's all the underwear you had. You didn't have panties. That didn't happen until about the 1920s, when you started to have that kind of underwear. That's because it's just harder to, you got all these skirts and petticoats and things to get out of the way when you have to go to the bathroom. So just easier. Also, I think there were some of the Moors of the time period and later, women were not supposed to dress like men, and men were not supposed to dress like women. That was against the church. So I have to assume if you're wearing underwear that's kind of pant-like, that was not okay. I don't know. It's just easier, I guess, if you have to go to the bathroom or walking across a field, just lift up the skirt a little bit. Okay, I'm going on again. So it was easier. There is a way to walk when you wear a long skirt all the time, going downstairs, going upstairs. There is a way that you feel different. And consequently, men too, wearing, again, they have the blouse underneath, or the shift, long sleeves. And by the way, linen, you wore white linen for the shifts, and for the men, they also had underpants as well. That was all white, and it was made of linen because it would last longer, because that's what you wash. You don't wash the outer dress, because clothes are expensive, and washing your clothes destroys it. You might have noticed that with your clothes. If you wash and dry your clothes so often, they wear out. So you wouldn't be washing these velvet things, these wonderful embroidered whatever you were wearing. That would be brushed and spot checked, get the spots out. But you would wash the underclothes. So you'd always have clean clothes against you, whether your outer clothes were that clean or not, but so all these details. So maybe some guy's working in the field and he's taken off his outer clothes and he's just working in his shift. I mean, that happened a lot. Or the women are working, in the kitchens, and they unpinned their outer sleeves so they can roll up the underones. And those are all the views you're getting of other people. You're not getting told all these details, but you're seeing them. So all of these little details. Now, one of my favorite things, weapons.
Oh.
I love the weapons. So, because my character fights with swords and daggers, I needed to know how, in fact, you do that. And it's not anything like what you see in movies. They get it wrong every single time. Even my very all-time favorite medieval movie, medieval in quotes, The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. One of my favorites. And he and Guy of Gisborne are fighting each other with their swords as if they are foils. Fencing. You don't fight that way with this. This is heavier, number one. It's only 3 pounds, but it can get heavy if you're swinging around a lot. This is the standard length of a broadsword. It's 44 inches long. This is a one-handed weapon, but you can use 2 hands. You've got your gauntlet on. You can use it like this for stabbing, like right in their helmet, right there. The pommel is your counterweight. So this guy, the pommel, very heavy. So you can really knock somebody in the face with that. This, the cross guard that protects your hand, also serves like a hook. You can put it down by their feet, trip them. So you're using this very organically. You're not just, doing on guard. Huh. And you're mostly not stabbing with it because that's not what this is. This is a hacking weapon. You're hacking them. You hack their ankles. Once you hack their ankles, they can fight back because they're down. So there's a lot of the ways that when you're going to write about it, you have to choreograph it in your mind. So you got to do it right. Because let me tell you about historical books. Somebody always knows. And if you get something wrong, they're happy to tell you that you got it wrong. So don't do that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to open this up for questions. Hopefully you have some about anything, about writing, about history, about writing history, publishers. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
I'm curious to know, what was your inspiration to become an author?
Well, when I was, I had been a graphic designer working in Los Angeles for years, and it was a great job. But then I had to sort of put it aside to have a baby. And when I did that, I was in advertising. It was fast paced and, you late hours and all kinds of things you had to put up with. But once I had a baby and I was staying at home, I didn't want to do that anymore. I was not wanting to get into that fast pace. I was at a slow pace. I was doing other things. But I still wanted to work at home. I had to do something to help make a living. And it was always a long time hobby of mine to be a novelist. I mean, I was writing stories just for fun. My husband never knew this, but I had long novels under my belt. And I thought, I really like historical novels. It's my favorite thing to read. I think I want to try to do this for real. So I started researching it, all the things I had to do, and how to format the manuscript because it's got to get sent to an agent and then an editor. So I researched all that. I went to my husband and I said, I think I really want to try to do this. I think I'd give it a shot. It's something I could do at home. And he says, well, I'll support you, but do you write novels? I said, oh yeah, I do. I forgot to tell you. I've been doing that for years. So that started that way, and And then I got it. It took a few years to get an agent. But I was writing books all that time. As soon as I finished one, I started the next one. So, and all of that was helping me on my skills and all that. And so I got my first agent, and she almost sold one of my books, but it didn't happen. And after we were together 3 years, not having a lot of success, we parted ways amiably. And then I got a second agent, and I was still writing different books. Couldn't get arrested. Third agent. I think after 9/11, because she was in New York, she sort of flaked out. And we parted ways that way. Or was she the one that I fired? I don't know. I forget these things. And finally, I was kind of fed up with that at this point. I thought, well, are there small presses I can sell these books to? I can do it without an agent. But I finally, on a whim, I had, by this time, I had started to write the Crispin series. I had already talked to that first agent. I was writing a medieval mystery. And on a whim, I sent manuscript off to this agent. And because his assistant there had a degree in medieval history, I thought, okay, I'm just going to try this. I don't care what happens. So when it's like when you're not looking for a boyfriend, one shows up. And he loved it, and we worked together, and we signed, and he it was Cup of Blood. It was this one that didn't sell, but the editor at St. Martin's remembered this book. I guess he didn't feel it was ready, but he contacted my agent. He said, "Does she have anything else that she wrote?" Well, I'd already written 2 more novels in the series just to get going, And I had just turned this in to my agent. And he says, "Why, yes, she does." And he didn't read it. He just sent it off to him. And in a week, I had my first contract with a big New York publisher. And it only took 14 years.
Oh, my. Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's dedication. So
Yeah.
it always dismays me when I see so many authors really jumping to self-publish. I don't think it's a good idea. It's not a good idea for your career, number one, because I don't know how much they've been writing. I don't know how much feedback they've had. And you're only a debut author once. You only get that chance once. And if you're with a publisher, a big publisher especially, they will make a big deal out of you, and you will get out there. And I know something like 14 years just is very daunting to people. It was pretty daunting for me, but excuse me, I think it only helped me to really concentrate and get better at what I was doing. And having an agent and having publishers, it gets you out there. The publisher has a catalog that reaches into bookstores and libraries all over the place, and that's the imprimatur from
Right.
the librarians. Look at that and go, "Oh, St. Martin's must be good. We'll give it a shot. We'll spend part of our dwindling budget on this." So I get that, but trying to be discovered when you're self-published is nearly impossible. So I always tell people, please go the traditional route first, and then become a hybrid like me. I self-publish books now as well, and they get more notice because they've seen my name before. So, and I get sub crossover traffic from the Crispin books to my paranormals, those lovely people who read anything I write. I love them. But there are people that just like the medieval mysteries. I get that. They just like the historicals and they won't read anything else. That's fine. That's cool. Everybody's got their own things that they like. So that's where that happened.
Thank you.
How long does it take you to write a book, Jeri?
I'm sorry?
How long does it take you to write a book?
How long does it take? Generally, including research time, It's 9 months. So it's a 9-month gestation for all books. But sometimes a little less, but usually not. So I can get 2 books written a year. And anything, and I did 3 one time, and I will never do that again. It's just too much stress. And it instead of being easier for me, it's getting harder. I'm just getting older. My attention span just goes.
Well, explanations you gave us, it makes it so much better and easier to understand and follow the books. I think it has helped me tremendously to write this type of books.
Well, I hope that you understand every author that writes. They go through all of this stuff, the same thing. Even if you're writing a contemporary, you have to do research. If you're writing a book that's in New York, you have to know about the subways and their stops, and the streets and what's on those streets. And sometimes you add a restaurant that doesn't exist there. That's fine. But I mean, you want that solid foundation in the time period. Writing a current book, it's not as much research maybe, but there's a lot of research that's involved. I tell you what the hardest thing is. You see, you're writing a recent book of like 20 to 50 years ago. That's harder.
Really?
Because now you have to remember, well, do they have full phone booths or just those little half one? Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Would you know? I don't. I'd have to research that. And credit cards, women didn't have credit cards at a certain time period. We weren't allowed to have them. We had our husbands or something. I remember it was a big deal. And my mom finally got her own credit card. And just various things, when were seatbelts, and all of the little details that we think we know, but we forgot. So that's harder, I think.
I think I love I'm an historical fiction lover, and so I love all that part in your Christmas series. But on top of that, it's not just history, your storylines and how you come up with those and the twists and turns, because all this time you're talking about all the research in it, but then you have to add the story part. You're amazing at that. How do you do that?
Well, thank you. The story sometimes comes from the relic. What's the relic going to bring to the story?
Yeah.
But it's also sometimes the murder. And like Spiteful Bones, the most recent one. Where the heck is it? It's a great cover. Where are you? There you are. I love this cover. Spiteful Bones. Yeah. It's the penultimate book.
Okay.
That one started because my idea was, well, what if you found a skeleton in the wall? What would that skeleton be? How would Crispin find out about a 20-year-old murder? You can't go back to files or forensics or anything like that. So how would that be? And it just, I don't know, it kind of unfolds for me, some of these things. If they didn't, it makes it very hard to write. But I guess you just, as you start writing it, ideas present themselves because of the characters, how the characters react to things. How is this happening? As he begins his investigation and starts asking questions. And I always imagine if I were doing that, if I were asked questions, what would be the pertinent questions I'd want to know? And it has to be in a time period, of course, where you can't do the forensics. You can't pick up the phone if you have a question. You have to go to the various places and ask. So that's how it is. It just begins to unfold. I mean, each thing that you find out opens up another avenue. That opens up another. So everything's a flower. Everything's a flower or an onion. I mean, how good it is.
But you have the talent to know that that's the difference.
I hope most writers do.
Yeah, I do.
It's just, I don't know, it's an extra thing in our lizard brain.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Anything else?
You're just so much fun to have as a guest speaker because we learned so much.
Yes.
I have a question, Jeri. you tell such an amazing description of what, you know, in your process of writing this book. Do you ever teach like classes on medieval history or anything?
I have done little seminars well, like I've gone to some colleges and spoken, but I've done seminars like at conventions and conferences. That's about it. It's like a one-day thing.
So many history teachers are so dry, and you're not.
Yes, that can be a problem. I mean, and I've heard this so many times from people. My history teachers at school were so boring. They memorize dates and battles, and I'm like, that's the most uninteresting part of it.
Yeah.
Tell the people what they did, you know, for what were their bathhouses like? What were the brothels like? I mean, tell them
things that that you'll remember, and not dates.
Well, yeah, you sure will. But yeah, and their pets' names. I mean, the pets, that such bizarre names. They didn't name them like names. They had, well, I guess we named Fluffy, things like that. But they had some of those names are hilarious. I can't even think of any of them now. But I mean, they had like marmots, or not marmots, martlets, minks, and stoats as pets, and occasional monkey, and squirrels. They had squirrel. They had them on little chains, you know, on their shoulder. So, you know, interesting. All those things. Fascinating.
Great.
And that you had the time to come, and, you know, in your busy schedule, and you came and stayed for over an hour with us and really show us so much about the medieval era. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I know I wasn't, it was more recent that I was here, but I wasn't here, so this is different.
Yeah.
Wonderful time.
Well, thank you for having me all, and you know, look at the website and check out the books. This is about to end this series.
We will read it, because now, you know, you enjoy a lot more when you know more about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
We don't get too many people that write about medieval history or medieval times. So you're unique on that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Buy books.
Right.
Keep writing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
So,
and Nancy, you can email me about.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thanks.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
good.
So long, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.